This is Dr. Kee. He's a reader in inorganic chemistry here at Leeds University. I hear he's recently been made an Aurora Research Fellow, which I hear is a good commendation to have. A major research topic in the Kee Lab is investigation into phosphorus compounds, which may be deposited on Earth by meteorites. Is that?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Brief? So he's going to be talking to us today. So, did life on Earth begin on Earth? And without further ado, I'll hand over to him.
Let's do it. Thanks, John. That's absolutely great.
Thank you.
Oh, we haven't heard it yet. It might be brewing and throwing eggs in a little bit. Right, well, first of all, can I just say it's a real pleasure to be here today. It's an absolute delight to come down to the basement, because I used to lecture here to our second year chemistry undergraduates a year or two back, and it was quite an occasion. I always like this theatre. Yeah, as Johnny said, I am technically speaking an inorganic chemist, and I'm interested in phosphorus. I'm not going to tell you anything about that here today. I'm going to tell you more about the sort of things that I'm interested in general, which is really questions such as this. My research area is really in abiogenesis, the origins of life. I'm not really going to talk about that today. I'm really going to focus on giving you just one particular aspect, one side of the story, if you like. So that's a euphemism for saying it ain't going to be balanced. Did life on Earth begin on Earth? Ultimately, I'm not going to give you an answer, because you make your own mind up about it. But I'm just going to tell you about a little story, and hopefully tell you a little bit about what scientists are interested in, why they're interested in this question now. Really, I guess it goes back to the formation of our solar system. There's a swirling mass of dust and heated interstellar materials, atoms, etc., from which our own planet eventually coalesced some 4.6 billion years ago. And as you can see, we've got a sort of environment we envisage, we don't know because we were never there, we envisage an environment on the early Earth that was somewhere between a rather warm sunny day in Ilkley and perhaps something a little less balmy, but rather extremes of condition. And out of these extremes of environment, so life emerged. Bacterial life, plant life, and mammalian life such as ourselves. The big question is, how did that actually take place? Before we go into that, and before I tell you about some of those sorts of things, I guess it's perhaps appropriate to mention one other problem. One other problem that is actually kind of significant. And that is, what exactly is life? How would you define it? The ancient Aborigines of Australia, for example, had a way of defining what life was. I'm not going to read this out to you. Read it through as I'm chatting away. You'll see it's rather unusual. It's a story. It's a story about how life evolved. And that story involves strange creatures called the Ungambicula, however that's pronounced. It involves shapeless bundles. It involves carving things with great stone knives. It involves things that Aborigines would have been used to. So life for them, and the origins of life, was relatively complex. But what they didn't try to do is say life is this thing. That's because nobody today agrees on a definition for life. Nobody says that life is X. There are, and I think books have actually been produced, which list all the different definitions there are of life. And there are at least 50 different definitions. You can define life according to the characteristics that you might expect life to display, such as this set of characteristics called MERINS, which stands for movement, excretion, respiration, reproduction, irritability, nutrition, growth, structure, yada, yada, yada. There are a few problems with that. For example, reproduction. Postmenopausal woman, or a chap who has been neutered, unfortunately, cannot reproduce, so therefore is not alive by this definition. NASA, in its search for life elsewhere in the universe, adopts this rather simple definition. It is a self-sustained chemical system capable of undergoing Darwinian evolution. it's by no means accepted by everybody, this particular definition. In fact, some people I've heard it say is absolutely crap. But it does have two very important things. Number one, it mentions Darwin. We know about evolution, or we think we know about evolution. And number two, it mentions chemical systems. I'm a chemist, so I immediately like this sort of thing. It puts chemistry at the heart of life. And hopefully I will tell you a little bit about why that should be. There is Charles Darwin, of course, The Origin of Species, 1859. So there we are, we're on 150 or so years, 151 years now since the publication of The Origin of Species. What Darwin recognised is that he recognised that there is a difference between the individual and a population. And everything about genetics, which I'm not going to talk about here at all, is all to do with the survival of populations, not to do with the survival of individuals. So I'm going to take out all discussion of Darwinian evolutions and things like that. But what Darwin also says that's quite important is that life as a population must be intertwined inextricably with its environment. And that is something that I'm going to stress. The role of environment and the extremes of environment under which life can possibly survive. Just a couple of other names to throw at you from the past. These are sort of classic figures in origin of life circles. Alexander Oparin, Russian scientist, and J.D. Bernal, who was a British crystallographer, they both recognised something particularly important in the 20s. Operaism said there is no fundamental difference between a living organism and lifeless matter. His point was that chemistry is at the heart of lifeless matter, but chemistry is also at the heart of living beings. Forget all the biology, malarkey, chemistry is at the heart of it. Again, I like that. Buy into that. And he also says that the only real difference between chemistry and biology is levels of complexity. Things in life start simple and get more complex. That's a sort of inexorable consequence of the process of evolution. Not just Darwinian evolution, but evolution of everything. Computer programs, cars, societies. They start simple, get more complex. Bernal said pretty much the same thing, but he added an extra layer to what Oparin was talking about in the 20s. And in the 50s, Bernal said, yes, okay, start simple, start with simple chemicals. And what could be simpler than bits of dirt? He considered bits of dirt, chemically they're clay materials, mixtures of aluminium and silicon and oxygen. I'm not going to go into the boring chemical details here. But what he said was those bits of dirt are actually known to form parts of meteorites. So these are materials not from the Earth, but what they are is they're materials that existed at the same time as our Earth was born and haven't undergone changes since, whereas our Earth has. And what he said was that meteorites could have provided some of these clays, these bits of dust, and that might have had a role to play in bringing chemicals, including organic matter, to Earth. So this is where we're starting to say, well, okay, chemistry is at the heart of life, and biology and life is really chemistry writ large but writ more complex, and that in order to get to some of these chemicals, it's quite possible that some of them might not have been on our early Earth, some of them might have been provided from outside our Earth's environment, extraterrestrial sources. And this is an idea that has now actually, and I'm going to take you at the end of this talk, I'm going to take you to some of the latest current results published only a year or two ago by my colleague Zita Martins in Imperial College, which are really quite neat, I think. But these ideas are now treated kind of seriously. Of course, they didn't, Bernal and Oparin, they didn't just arrive at these ideas by themselves. They were working from ideas that others had put forward before them. And I'm going to mention those in a moment. I'd almost forgotten about this chap. Carl Sagan. He's the reason I became a scientist. I remember in the 70s, late 70s, watching this DVD series called Cosmos. I don't know if any of you guys remember that. If you haven't, don't worry. It's worth getting on DVD. 50 quid for the whole series. Fantastic. Money worth spent. Well spent. What he did was he showed how the whole universe and life are intimately interlinked. And I'm afraid I have no idea why I became a chemist, but now, 20 years after I became a chemist, I'm now actually coming back to looking at some of Sagan's ideas. He took out Bernal's ideas, and he actually went a bit further, and he calculated how much material, how much organic material could have been brought to the Earth through impacts with comets and meteorites. And it's quite fantastic, the amounts that we're talking about. Trillions and trillions of tons. Enough material to cover 10 metres of the Earth's surface with organic material. That's a lot of organic material. But of course these ideas, and Sagan, Oparin and Bernal I've mentioned, they were respected scientists. These were guys whom others looked up to and said, okay, I believe what you're saying to me because you are the great and the good. But they were following the great and the good that went before them, and in particular a couple of guys, Lord Kelvin from the 1870s, and the Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius in the early part of the 20th century. These guys were, again, standing on the shoulders of other giants to propose a far more fanciful idea. They didn't just believe that chemicals could come to the Earth through meteoritic and dust particles. They thought that life itself could come to the Earth. And this was an idea called panspermia, which you can see at the top there. They were thinking of, this was just at the time, the latter part of the 19th century, where bacteria, Louis Pasteur was doing his famous experiments on bacteria, pasteurization. The idea of a whole microscopic world beneath what we could see with our naked eyes was just becoming a reality. And these guys were thinking, well, hang on, maybe these microbes, they could have come from space. They weren't the first to propose it. What they were the first serious scientists to believe in it and propose it. And I do wish that my next clip would start. It's not running, unfortunately. I don't know if I did run when I tried it earlier. I had a little clip here called panspermia. If you go to YouTube, plug in panspermia, you'll get to this little clip. It's just a little funny clip. I'm sorry I can't. But what I really want to say is these ideas, proposed by serious scientists, did they have any weight? At the time that these guys were proposing them, 1870s and the early part of the 20th century, even though they were famous scientists, their ideas weren't really well received by the scientific community. They obviously weren't well received by most religious communities, but scientists poo-pooed them. Why? Because they didn't think it was possible. Scientists today, I think it's arguably correct to say that we do not poo-poo these ideas now. We do believe that they are worthy of scientific investigation because there is evidence to suggest that perhaps the idea of panspermia is not as far-fetched as we originally believed. Arrhenius and Kelvin were thinking of the seeds of life as being bacteria. In fact, they weren't just thinking about them as simple bacteria. Here's one, Staphylococcus epidermidis, which is a bacteria on our skins. It's a very important part of our skin's reproductive cycle, repair cycle. Bacteria like that were not really what they had in mind. What they did have in mind was bacterial spores, because many bacteria have a very valuable characteristic. And that is, they have the ability to survive and function under quite extreme conditions. And this is science that no one knew at the time of Arrhenius and Kelvin. For example, it wasn't known that bacteria can survive and live under about 15 kilometres worth of rock. The type of bacteria that do this are called lithophilic. These are bacteria which love rocks. Litho means earth. And they live within very small cracks. This particular photo here is taken under a South African gold mine. That's about 6 kilometres deep. But bacteria can survive a lot deeper than that. So bacteria can live in rock. Why can't they then be blown inside, trapped inside a piece of rock from one planet to the next? Well, we know they live in rock, so they could potentially survive in rock. Of course, bacteria themselves, as I say, they can be quite fragile. They can also be quite hardy, as I'll tell you. But one aspect of bacteria that is quite unique, certainly when compared to